In a dimly lit nursing home nestled in the heart of Mexico, the air felt heavy with the weight of forgotten lives and unspoken regrets. Don Alfredo sat in a corner, his frail figure hunched over as he gazed out the window. Outside, the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows that danced across the barren courtyard. Memories flooded his mind, sharp and vivid, yet tinged with the bitter taste of betrayal. The sound of laughter and chatter echoed faintly in the distance, a stark contrast to the silence that enveloped him. He could hear the cheerful voices of the staff as they interacted with the other residents. But for Alfredo, those sounds felt like a cruel reminder of what he had lost. He recalled the day his sons, Carlos and Javier, had left him there, their promises of regular visits fading into empty echoes. "Just until we get back on our feet, Papa," Carlos had said, his voice laced with a hint of guilt that Alfredo had foolishly believed. Javier, standing beside his brother, had nodded in agreement, his eyes avoiding Alfredo's. They had packed his belongings, discarded the few items that had once filled their family home with warmth, and left him to the sterile confines of the nursing home. Alfredo clenched his fists, the memory igniting a flicker of rage within him. The betrayal cut deeper than any physical wound. He had spent his life providing for them, sacrificing his dreams so they could chase theirs. And this was how they repaid him, by abandoning him to the care of strangers. "Miserable ingrates," he muttered under his breath, his voice barely audible over the droning of the overhead lights. As the evening wore on, the memory of a once joyful family gathering surfaced, illuminating the darkness that threatened to engulf him. He could almost smell the delicious aroma of his late wife's cooking wafting through the air, mingling with the sound of their children's laughter. They had gathered around the dining table, the clinking of glasses punctuating the air as they toasted to family and love. "Familia es lo más importante," his wife, Eleanor, always reminded them, her eyes sparkling with affection. "Family is the most important thing." Alfredo closed his eyes, picturing her radiant smile, the way her laughter could fill a room. She had been the glue that held their family together, nurturing their bonds with love and care. Without her, the threads had unraveled, leaving him to pick up the pieces alone. "Do you remember that Christmas when we got snowed in?" he whispered to the empty room as nostalgia washed over him. "We built a snowman in the backyard, and you two were so proud of your creation." His heart ached with the memory, a bittersweet reminder of a time when their family was whole. But that joy had long since faded, replaced by the harsh reality of loneliness. Back in the present, as the shadows lengthened, Carlos and Javier sat across from each other at a dimly lit restaurant, their plates half-finished and their voices low. The clinking of cutlery and muffled conversations from nearby tables formed a background hum, but their focus was entirely on the estate that awaited them. "Thank God we finally got rid of him," Carlos said, relief washing over his features. "I mean, what were we thinking? It was a burden we just couldn't carry anymore." Javier nodded, his expression grim but resolute. "It was for the best. He wouldn't have wanted us to sacrifice our lives for him. We've got our own futures to think about." He pushed a piece of steak around his plate, avoiding his brother's gaze. The truth was, he felt a twinge of guilt, but he quickly buried it beneath layers of rationalization. "Still, it's hard to believe he just accepted it," Carlos continued, leaning back in his chair. "I thought he would fight us more. I mean, he's always been so stubborn." Javier scoffed, shaking his head. "Old age does that to a person. He's probably just given up. Besides, we're doing what's right for us. We can't let him hold us back." Their conversation hung heavy in the air, filled with a mix of relief and an undercurrent of unease. Outside, a distant siren wailed, mingling with the city's nightlife. Yet inside the restaurant, a palpable tension settled between the brothers, each grappling with their choices in silence. As the waiter approached with the bill, Carlos glanced at Javier. "You think he'll be okay? I mean, in that place?" Javier shrugged, dismissing the concern with a wave of his hand. "It's not like we can do anything about it now. He has doctors and nurses. He's not alone." But even as he spoke, doubt gnawed at him, a whisper that perhaps they had made a grave mistake. The brothers settled their bill, their conversation drifting back to logistics and plans for the future. They discussed investments and travel, their minds momentarily distracted from the weight of their actions. Yet, somewhere deep inside, a flicker of unrest lingered, an unspoken acknowledgement that their father's absence would echo in their lives in ways they couldn't yet comprehend. Meanwhile, in the nursing home, Alfredo continued to stare out the window, lost in thought. The sun had fully set, and the darkness outside mirrored the void he felt within. He had made a decision that would change everything. The pain of betrayal had become a catalyst for a plan he had been crafting in the shadows of his mind. "Carlos, Javier," he whispered into the silence, his voice laced with determination. "You will regret this." A small smile crept across his lips, a hint of the man he once was, a man who had endured much and was now ready to take back control of his destiny. The nursing home may have stripped him of his physical strength, but it would not strip him of his will. As the night deepened, Alfredo's resolve hardened. He began to plot a course that would reveal the true nature of his sons, a plan that would not only expose their betrayal, but would also challenge everything they thought they knew about family and loyalty. The stage was set and the players were in place. Little did Carlos and Javier know that their lives were about to be irrevocably altered by the man they had so callously abandoned. With each passing moment, the anticipation grew, and the darkness that surrounded Alfredo transformed into a cloak of determination. He would no longer be a forgotten relic in a nursing home. He would become the architect of his own fate, a fate intertwined with the very sons who had forsaken him. And as the first light of dawn broke the silence of the night, Alfredo's heart raced with the promise of revenge. In the oppressive silence of the nursing home, the fluorescent lights flickered intermittently, casting a ghostly glow on the beige walls. Don Alfredo, hunched in his wheelchair, strained to catch snippets of conversation happening just outside his room. The faint sound of laughter and the rustle of medical charts floated in the air, but it was a different conversation that piqued his interest. Two nurses, Marisol and Luisa, were chatting in the hallway, their voices a mixture of sympathy and frustration. Alfredo leaned slightly forward, his heart racing as he strained to hear every word. "Can you believe some families?" Marisol exclaimed, her voice tinged with indignation. "They just drop off their loved ones and never look back. It's like they forget they're human." "It's heartbreaking," Luisa replied, shaking her head. "I've seen it so many times. They come, drop them off with a few belongings, and vanish. It's as if they think that once they're here, it's no longer their responsibility." Alfredo felt a surge of anger boiling within him. The bitterness of betrayal was a familiar taste, one he had come to loathe since his sons had abandoned him. He clenched his fists on the armrests of his wheelchair, imagining the faces of Carlos and Javier as they nonchalantly walked away from him that fateful day. "They're just a burden to them," Marisol continued. "Some families even argue about the money once the elder is gone. It's disgusting." Alfredo's heart sank at her words. His sons had indeed spoken about his estate over dinner as if he were a mere object to be divided rather than a father deserving of love and respect. His mind raced with memories of their laughter, their childhood, and the values he had tried to instill in them. How could they have turned into such self-serving men? "Sometimes I wonder if they're even worthy of inheriting anything," Luisa mused. "It's sad, really." Alfredo's resolve hardened. They would not get away with this. He had spent too long in this place, nursing his wounds, and it was time for him to take action. As the nurses walked away, oblivious to the storm brewing inside him, Alfredo's mind raced with thoughts of revenge. A twisted smile crept onto his lips. If they thought they could abandon him without consequences, they were gravely mistaken. Determined, Alfredo wheeled himself toward the small desk in the corner of his room, where a well-worn notebook lay alongside a faded pen. He opened the notebook, the pages yellowed with age, and began to write. His hand shook slightly, not from age, but from excitement. Each stroke of the pen felt like a declaration, a promise to himself that he would reclaim his dignity. He penned his thoughts meticulously, outlining his will. But this would not be a simple document of inheritance, it would be a weapon. "To my beloved sons, Carlos and Javier," he wrote, "I leave you a lesson in betrayal." He paused, letting the words sink in, savoring the power he was beginning to wield over them. As he continued to write, the words flowed with a clarity he hadn't felt in years. He detailed his intentions, leaving specific assets tied to conditions that would ensure his sons would face the consequences of their actions. "To Carlos, I leave the family home, provided he visits me once a month for the next year. To Javier, I leave the car, contingent on his commitment to attend family therapy sessions." Alfredo chuckled darkly as he imagined their reactions. They would be forced to confront the very decisions that had led them to abandon him. He paused, considering if he should add a final twist, something that would truly shock them. After a moment of reflection, he scribbled a note at the end of his will. "And to both of you, I leave the burden of your guilt, which will haunt you until the day you reconcile with your past." He closed the notebook, satisfied. The catharsis of writing had ignited a fire within him, a sense of purpose he thought he had lost forever. With each word, he felt the weight of abandonment lifting, replaced by a fierce determination for justice. Meanwhile, across town, Carlos and Javier were seated at a restaurant, their plates half full, their conversation far from light-hearted. The dim lighting and soft music couldn't mask the tension that hung in the air. "Did you hear about Dad's health?" Carlos asked, breaking the silence. He fiddled with his fork, avoiding eye contact with his brother. "Yeah, I heard he's not doing well," Javier replied, his voice lacking any real concern. "But what do you want me to do about it? We've already talked about this. He's in a better place, and we have our lives to live." Carlos sighed, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "I know. But what if he really is deteriorating? We can't just ignore him completely, can we?" "Why not? He made his choices. We're not responsible for his life choices," Javier retorted, his tone defensive. "Besides, he's always been manipulative. We visit him and he'll start pulling on our heartstrings again. I can't deal with that." Carlos leaned back in his chair, his expression a mixture of anger and sadness. "You're being cold. He's still our father, regardless of how things ended up. What if he doesn't have much time left?" Javier scoffed, shaking his head. "You're seriously contemplating going back there? You think he'll just be grateful? No, if we go back, he'll expect us to take him home or something ridiculous." "Maybe we owe him that much," Carlos insisted, his voice rising. "He deserves to see us, to know that we care." "Care?" Javier snapped. "Is that what you call it? Because it sounds to me like you're just feeling guilty. And let's be honest, he's not the same man anymore. He's just a liability." Carlos clenched his jaw, frustration boiling over. "Don't you get it? We can't keep pretending like this never happened. He is our father. He may have made mistakes, but so have we. We're not perfect either." Javier opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, his phone buzzed on the table. He glanced at the screen, his expression shifting from irritation to concern. "It's the nursing home," he said, his voice suddenly serious. "I should take this." As he answered the call, Carlos watched his brother's face, a knot forming in his stomach. He had hoped that Javier might see reason, but now he feared the worst. The conversation was quick, and Javier's brow furrowed with each word. Finally, he ended the call and looked at Carlos with a grave expression. "That was the nursing home," he said slowly. "Dad's health has taken a turn for the worse. They think we should come by soon." Carlos felt a mixture of relief and dread wash over him. "What do we do?" "We go," Javier said reluctantly, his voice low. "But let's not make this a big deal. We're not going to fall for his games again." Carlos nodded, his heart heavy with the weight of what lay ahead. "Let's just get this over with," he said quietly, knowing that the visit would be fraught with unspoken tensions and unresolved feelings. As they left the restaurant, a storm brewed on the horizon, both literally and metaphorically. Thunder rumbled in the distance, mirroring the turmoil within each brother's heart. The reality of their father's situation loomed over them, forcing them to confront not just their past, but the consequences of their choices. And somewhere in that nursing home, Alfredo was ready, pen still fresh with ink, waiting for the moment to reclaim the narrative of his life. Alfredo sat in his usual spot by the window, the muted sunlight filtering through the sheer curtains of the nursing home. The air was thick with the scent of antiseptic, a constant reminder of the sterile environment that had become his prison. Today, however, there was a flicker of anticipation in his heart, a pulse of energy that cut through the monotony of the day. He had been informed that a lawyer would be visiting him, and while he had little faith in the legal system, he couldn't shake the feeling that this meeting might change everything. As the clock ticked steadily towards the appointed hour, Alfredo's mind raced with thoughts of his sons, Carlos and Javier. Their faces had become etched in his memory, not as the boys he had raised, but as the men who had betrayed him. The image of them walking away from him that day, their backs turned and their promises of visits fading like ghosts, haunted him. He had spent countless hours replaying that moment in his mind, but this time he was determined to confront them, to make them realize the weight of their abandonment. The door creaked open, and in walked a tall man in a sharp suit, his demeanor exuding an air of authority. Alfredo straightened in his chair, peering up at the newcomer with curiosity. The lawyer introduced himself as Mr. Mendoza, his voice smooth and measured. "Good afternoon, Senor Alfredo. I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time." Alfredo chuckled softly, a hint of defiance in his tone. "There's no such thing as a bad time when you're waiting for the end to come, Mr. Mendoza." Mendoza offered a professional smile, though it seemed to falter slightly at the older man's dark humor. "I'm here concerning your estate. You've named me the executor of your will, and I need to go over some important details with you." The mention of his will sent a thrill through Alfredo. This was it, the opportunity he had been waiting for. "Ah, yes, my will," he replied, his voice low and gravelly. "What do you have to say about it?" "Firstly, I must inform you that your sons are aware of this meeting. They've expressed an interest in your health and your affairs. They are on their way here as we speak," Mendoza said, flipping through a folder filled with documents. "They seem to believe that there is still time to mend their relationship with you." A bitter laugh escaped Alfredo's lips. "Mend? They don't even know what the word means. They left me here to rot." Mr. Mendoza shifted uncomfortably but continued. "It's important that we discuss your wishes before they arrive. You have a unique opportunity to address their actions and decide how you wish to distribute your assets after your passing." Alfredo leaned forward, a glint of mischief lighting up his eyes. "Ah, yes, that's the fun part, isn't it? I've composed quite the narrative for them." Mendoza raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "What do you mean by that?" "Let's just say that I've been inspired by their betrayal. I want them to feel the weight of their choices. The estate isn't just about money, it's about legacy, about family." Alfredo's voice dropped to a whisper, almost conspiratorial. "And I intend to remind them of what they've done." Just then, the door swung open again, and Carlos and Javier entered, their expressions a mix of concern and reluctance. The brothers exchanged glances, their body language betraying their nervousness. They had rehearsed their lines, but the atmosphere in the room was charged with an energy they couldn't quite grasp. "Father," Carlos began, his voice hesitant, "we came as soon as we heard. We wanted to check on you." Alfredo's lips curled into a smirk. "How kind of you, Carlos. The concern is palpable." "What's going on, Dad?" Javier cut in, his tone defensive. "We just want to make sure you're okay. We didn't expect to find you with a lawyer." "Oh, this is no ordinary visit," Alfredo replied, his gaze flicking between the two men. "Mr. Mendoza is here to discuss my will. I thought it might be time to have a little family meeting, don't you think?" The tension in the room thickened, and Carlos frowned, glancing at Javier for support. "You're not seriously going to talk about that now, are you? You need to focus on your health, Dad." Alfredo chuckled again, this time with a tinge of bitterness. "My health? You abandoned me here, and now you want to feign concern? You think I don't see through your charade?" Javier shifted uncomfortably, his brow furrowing. "We've had our struggles, Dad. It wasn't easy for us. You know that, right?" Alfredo's eyes narrowed, his voice rising with indignation. "Struggles? You call abandoning your father in a nursing home a struggle? You looked me in the eye and walked away, Javier. You and your brother both did." Carlos stepped forward, his voice tinged with anger. "We had lives to lead. We can't just drop everything because you decided to grow old and frail. It's not our fault." "And yet," Alfredo said, his tone icy, "you seem to think you deserve something in return for your negligence. I'm here to inform you that you couldn't be more mistaken." "Dad, please," Javier started, but Alfredo cut him off. "No more please. This is my moment to speak, and you will listen. You wanted to rid yourselves of the burden of caring for me, and now you will face the consequences of that choice." He gestured to Mendoza, who was quietly observing the unfolding drama. "Consequences?" Carlos echoed, disbelief coloring his tone. "What do you mean?" Alfredo leaned back in his chair, a satisfied grin spreading across his face. "Let's just say that my will is a reflection of my feelings about how I've been treated. You'll both have the opportunity to see just how deep the rabbit hole goes." The brothers exchanged worried glances, the tension in the room palpable. Alfredo reveled in their discomfort, feeling a sense of empowerment that had long been stripped away from him. The time for revenge was close at hand, and he was ready to confront the demons of his past, all while ensuring that Carlos and Javier felt the repercussions of their actions. With the air thick with unresolved emotions, they stood in silence, the weight of Alfredo's words hanging heavily around them. A sense of impending confrontation loomed in the small room, and each second that passed felt like a countdown to an inevitable explosion of hidden truths and buried feelings. Alfredo looked at his sons, their faces a mixture of guilt and defiance, and for the first time in years he felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, justice was within his grasp. The air inside the nursing home felt thick with tension as Don Alfredo sat in his wheelchair, staring down the two figures who had once been the pride of his life. The dim light flickered above them, casting elongated shadows that danced across the room, echoing the tumultuous emotions swirling in the air. Carlos and Javier stood before him, their faces a mix of guilt and defensiveness as he prepared to unleash the storm he had been nurturing for far too long. "Do you even have any idea what it's like to be abandoned?" Alfredo's voice cut through the silence, sharp and unwavering. His frail body belied the strength of his words. You left me here, in this prison of your making, without a second thought. Carlos shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting to the floor as if searching for the right words. Father, we didn't abandon you. We thought it was for the best, he stammered, his voice lacking conviction. You can't expect us to handle everything. Handle everything? Alfredo's laugh was cold, devoid of humor. You think sending me to this place was handling anything? You think I wanted to rot away while you two squabble over my estate? You've shown me your true colors, selfishness wrapped in feigned concern. Javier, who had been silently seething next to Carlos, finally spoke up. You don't understand what we've been through, old man. You don't know how hard it's been to keep our lives together while trying to manage your care. You think it's easy to juggle a family and a job. You've become a burden. A burden? Alfredo spat, his voice rising with indignation. I was never a burden to you. I raised you, taught you to be men of honor, and this is how you repay me? By throwing me away like yesterday's trash? The confrontation escalated, and the nursing home seemed to quiet down, the muffled sounds of other residents fading into the background. The tension between the three men hung heavily in the air, a palpable storm ready to unleash its fury. What do you want from us? Carlos finally shouted, frustration spilling over. You think we owe you something? We have our own lives. Alfredo leaned forward in his wheelchair, his eyes narrowing. What I want is your acknowledgement of what you've done, of how you've betrayed the very essence of family. Your mother would be ashamed of you both. At the mention of their late mother, both Carlos and Javier flinched. The pain of her loss was still fresh, buried beneath layers of resentment they had built over the years. Don't you dare bring her into this, father. She's gone, and it's time to move on. Javier shot back, his voice cracking with emotion. Alfredo's gaze softened momentarily, but it was quickly replaced by a steely resolve. Move on? You think you can just forget her? You think you can forget the values she instilled in us? Family comes first, and yet here you are, tearing each other apart over my estate. He paused, letting his words sink in. You're not the men I raised. You're shadows of what you could have been. Silence enveloped the room for a moment as the brothers exchanged glances, their defenses crumbling under the weight of their father's words. The air was thick with unspoken truths and buried emotions, old wounds that had never fully healed. Maybe we've made mistakes, Carlos admitted, his voice quieter now, laced with regret. But we had our reasons. You don't know what it's like to struggle, to feel like you're drowning while trying to keep everything afloat. Alfredo's expression softened slightly, but he wasn't ready to relent. Struggling? You think that's an excuse for abandoning your father? I may be old, but I'm not senile. I've seen through your lies, your excuses. It's not just about me, it's about the family we used to be. You don't understand, Javier interjected, his voice rising again. We couldn't keep taking care of you and managing our lives. It was too much. We thought... Thought what? Alfredo interrupted, his voice rising. That I wouldn't notice. That I wouldn't feel the emptiness in my chest every time you didn't show up. I may be in this chair, but I am still your father. I am still a man with feelings, with dignity. The room shook with the intensity of their emotions, and the nurses outside the door paused, exchanging worried glances. Inside, the confrontation was reaching a fever pitch, and the once gentle Alfredo had transformed into a force of nature, fueled by years of hurt and betrayal. As the confrontation simmered down, Alfredo took a deep breath, his chest rising and falling as he tried to regain composure. I have something to reveal, he said, his tone shifting to something more contemplative, almost ominous. Something you both need to hear. Carlos and Javier exchanged wary looks, their anger momentarily replaced by curiosity. "What is it?" Carlos asked, his brow furrowing. Alfredo leaned closer, lowering his voice as if sharing a dark secret. "You think you know everything there is to know about our family, about me, but there's a surprise waiting for you in my will, something that will change everything you believe to be true." "What are you talking about?" Javier pressed, his interest piqued despite himself. "What kind of surprise?" "Let's just say," Alfredo replied, a sly smile creeping onto his face, "that you might want to reconsider how you view your inheritance. The truth can be a powerful weapon, and I intend to use it." Carlos shook his head in disbelief, still grappling with the whirlwind of emotions they had just experienced. "What truth? What are you hiding from us?" "Patience, my sons," Alfredo said, the glint in his eye revealing a mix of mischief and determination. "All will be revealed soon enough. But first, you must reckon with what you've done. Only then will you truly understand the surprise I have in store for you." The brothers stood frozen, their minds racing. The tension in the air shifted, becoming a taut line between fear and anticipation, and the nursing home felt as if it had transformed into a battleground of emotions, each man standing firm on his side of an invisible line. "Is this some kind of game to you?" Carlos asked, frustration bubbling back to the surface. "You're toying with our lives." "Not a game, Carlos," Alfredo replied, his voice steady. "A reckoning. You've both played your parts in this family drama, and now it's time for the truth to come to light. I'll give you one last chance to make things right before the storm hits." As he spoke, the weight of his words hung in the air like a thundercloud, dark and foreboding. The brothers could feel the ground beneath them shifting, and the reality of their choices began to settle in. They were not just confronting their father, they were standing on the precipice of a revelation that could unravel everything they thought they knew about their family. "Think carefully about your next move," Alfredo warned, his eyes narrowing. "The truth is a powerful thing, and it can either tear you apart or bind you together. I suggest you choose wisely." The tension thickened, and the room felt smaller, as if the walls were closing in on them. The stage was set for the battle of wills, and as Alfredo sat back in his wheelchair, the smirk on his lips hinted at the storm that was about to unfold. A storm that would change everything for Carlos and Javier, whether they were ready or not. The day of the will reading had arrived, and tension hung in the air like a thick fog. Don Alfredo, sitting in his wheelchair, could hardly suppress the smirk that played on his lips as he observed his two sons, Carlos and Javier, fidgeting in their seats across the small conference room. The sterile walls of the nursing home felt even colder than usual, an environment that had become a prison for the old man. Yet today, he felt a sense of power that he had not experienced in years. Carlos, tall and broad-shouldered, shifted uncomfortably, adjusting his tie as if it were a noose tightening around his throat. His dark hair was slicked back, but the stress lines on his forehead betrayed his composed facade. "I just don't understand why he had to make us wait," he muttered under his breath, casting a wary glance at the lawyer seated across from him. "Maybe he's enjoying this," Javier responded, his voice laced with irritation. Javier was shorter, with a lean frame that always seemed to be on the verge of snapping. He had his mother's sharp features, the kind that could cut through any pretense. "He's always been dramatic. Probably thinks it's some kind of show." Alfredo let their whispers wash over him, a cruel satisfaction bubbling within. He had been stripped of dignity and family, but now he held their fate in his hands. The lawyer, a stoic man in his 50s with graying hair and a serious demeanor, cleared his throat, drawing the brothers' attention. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice steady but lacking warmth, "thank you for coming today. I trust you understand the importance of this meeting." His eyes flickered over to Alfredo, who sat motionless, a calculating expression etched on his face. Yeah, let's get on with it," Carlos snapped, his impatience evident. Alfredo leaned forward slightly, his feigned frailty belying the razor-sharp mind behind his weathered eyes. "Patience, my sons. All good things come to those who wait." His voice, though shaky, dripped with sarcasm that only he seemed to appreciate. The lawyer shuffled through a stack of papers before finally looking up, his expression unreadable. "We are here to read the last will and testament of Don Alfredo Martinez." He paused, allowing the weight of the moment to settle over everyone. "As the executor of this will, I will proceed with the reading." The room fell silent as the lawyer began to read. Each word echoed off the walls, filling the space with a palpable sense of foreboding. "I, Don Alfredo Martinez, being of sound mind and body, do hereby declare this to be my last will and testament." His voice rang out, a declaration that felt both final and liberating to Alfredo. Carlos and Javier exchanged glances, their initial bravado starting to wane. "What's he playing at?" Carlos whispered, his brow furrowing. "Just listen," Javier replied tersely. As the lawyer continued, he detailed the distribution of Alfredo's modest possessions, a few pieces of furniture, some personal effects, and his beloved guitar, which had once echoed with the laughter of family gatherings. The bequest was meager, but it was the next line that sent a shiver down their spines. "And to my two sons, Carlos and Javier," the lawyer said, looking directly at them, "I leave nothing." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap, and the brothers' faces blanched. "Nothing?" Carlos blurted, incredulous. "You can't be serious." "Silence," the lawyer commanded, his tone firm. "Please allow me to finish." Alfredo, relishing the moment, watched as the color drained from his sons' faces. Their disbelief morphed into anger, and he could see the gears turning in their minds, trying to comprehend the implications of their father's decision. "Why would you do this, father?" Javier's voice trembled slightly, a mixture of rage and hurt. "After everything we've done for you?" "Everything you've done?" Alfredo echoed, his voice rising slightly. "You mean everything you've neglected to do? You abandoned me to this place, and now you expect a reward." Carlos clenched his fists, his knuckles white. "You can't be serious. We were just trying to live our lives. You made it impossible to care for you." A thin smile crept across Alfredo's face, a veneer of satisfaction layered over years of pain. "And yet, here I am, still breathing, still capable of making my own decisions. And I choose to leave my fortune to those who truly need it, the abandoned elders of this community." "Charity?" Javier spat, incredulous. "You're leaving everything to a charity? You're just going to let us walk away with nothing?" "Enough!" the lawyer interjected, raising a hand. He took a deep breath, steeling himself against the rising tempers in the room. "There is one final clause to be revealed." A glimmer of hope flickered in Carlos's eyes. "What do you mean, a final clause?" "Let him read it," Alfredo said, his voice low but commanding. With a nod, the lawyer adjusted his glasses and continued, "To my sons, if they wish to contest this will, they must first uncover a truth about their mother's past, a truth that has remained hidden until now." The room fell silent again, the weight of this new revelation settling over the brothers like a shroud. "What truth?" Carlos demanded, his voice rising with urgency. "What are you talking about?" Alfredo leaned back in his wheelchair, the smirk returning as he savored the chaos he had unleashed. "Oh, my dear sons, it's a story that could change everything you thought you knew about your mother and our family." Javier's face twisted in confusion and anger. You can't just drop a bomb like that and leave us in the dark. What do you know?" "Enough," the lawyer said, holding up a hand again. "I will not divulge any information that is not in the will. But know this, your mother's past is intricately tied to a fortune that I suspect you may not even be aware of." The air grew thick with tension as Carlos and Javier exchanged nervous glances, their minds racing. "This isn't over," Carlos said finally, his voice hardening. "If there's something we need to know about Mom, we'll find out." Alfredo chuckled softly, the sound chilling in the silence. "Oh, you will, my sons, you will indeed. But be careful what you wish for. The past has a way of clawing its way back to the surface." As the will reading came to an end, the palpable tension was replaced by a heavy silence, thick with unanswered questions and unspoken fears. The brothers left the room, their faces pale and their minds swirling with uncertainty. Alfredo, watching them go, knew that the seeds of doubt had been planted, and he savored the taste of his victory. He had orchestrated this moment with meticulous care, and now the real game was set to begin. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear: the truth would come out, and when it did, everything would change. As the lawyer's voice faded into the background, a heavy silence enveloped the room. The weight of the revelations lingered in the air like a thick fog, and Don Alfredo could hardly suppress the smirk that tugged at the corners of his lips. He watched intently as Carlos and Javier exchanged bewildered glances, their faces a mix of disbelief and confusion. "Is this some kind of joke?" Carlos finally broke the silence, his voice shaking with incredulity. "You can't be serious, Dad. You're leaving everything to a charity, after everything we've done for you?" "Everything you've done," Alfredo echoed, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "You mean everything you've failed to do? Abandoning me in this place, Carlos? That's what you call doing something?" Javier, still processing the shock, leaned forward, his brow furrowing in agitation. "This doesn't make any sense. What charity? Why would you do this to us? We're your sons." Alfredo leaned back in his wheelchair, relishing the moment. He could see the flicker of panic in their eyes, the dawning realization that their father was not the frail, helpless man they had left behind. "Oh, my dear boys," he said, his voice smooth and deliberate. "You see, there's something you don't know. Something I've kept hidden all these years. A secret about your mother." Carlos's expression shifted from anger to confusion, his mind racing to catch up with the unfolding drama. "What about Mom? What secret?" Alfredo took a deep breath, allowing the tension to build before revealing the truth. "Your mother was not just a homemaker, as you both believed. She came from a wealthy family, a family that disowned her when she married me. They never approved of our union, but she left a considerable fortune behind when she passed away." "Fortune?" Javier scoffed, crossing his arms defensively. "You expect us to believe that? Mom always told us we didn't have any family money. She said that was why we lived modestly." Alfredo chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Your mother was a woman of integrity. She didn't want to burden you with the past or the family's shame. But I've kept her secret safe. That fortune has been sitting in a trust, untouched, waiting for the right moment." Carlos's eyes narrowed. "And what's this got to do with us?" "Everything," Alfredo replied, leaning forward in his chair. "The trust has specific conditions for accessing the funds. You both need to prove that you're worthy of it. Your actions, your choices, everything you've done since your mother's death will be taken into account. And right now, I'd say you're failing spectacularly." No, this can't be happening," Carlos muttered, running a hand through his hair in frustration. "You can't just dangle a fortune in front of us like that and expect us to play your twisted game." Alfredo's expression hardened. You think this is a game? You think I relish watching my own sons squabble like children? No, Carlos. This is about accountability. It's about recognizing the consequences of your choices. Javier's voice trembled as he spoke. So what? We have to earn your love now? After you've thrown us to the wolves? Earn my love? Alfredo echoed, his voice rising. You lost my love when you walked away from me. This is about understanding the value of family, something you both seem to have forgotten. But there's a way back. There's always a way back. Carlos stepped closer, his face flushed with anger. And what if we don't want it? What if we decide to walk away just like you did? Alfredo's eyes flashed with a mix of anger and amusement. Then you'll truly be left with nothing. No fortune, no family, just the regret of your choices. You see, I may be old and frail, but I'm not powerless. I have the means to ensure that you're held accountable. Javier's fists clenched at his sides. You're a manipulative bastard. Do you know that? You think you can control us even from this chair. Control you? Alfredo laughed, the sound echoing in the room. No, my dear sons. I'm simply offering you a choice, a way to redeem yourselves. You can fight for what's rightfully yours, or you can continue down this path of self-destruction. Silence fell upon the room once more as the weight of Alfredo's words settled in. The brothers exchanged glances, the animosity between them momentarily forgotten as they grappled with the implications of their father's revelations. What do we need to do? Carlos finally asked, his voice low and filled with uncertainty. Alfredo straightened in his wheelchair, a glint of satisfaction in his eyes. You need to demonstrate that you can be responsible, that you can care for those who cannot care for themselves. You'll need to volunteer at the charity that will inherit my estate. You must show me that you understand the value of family and community. Only then will I consider changing my will. Javier shook his head, disbelief etched across his features. You can't be serious. You're putting us through some twisted test? What if we refuse? Then you'll remain exactly where you are, empty, without family, and without the fortune your mother intended for you, Alfredo replied, his voice steady, filled with finality. The tension in the room was palpable as the brothers stood in silence, the magnitude of their father's ultimatum weighing heavily on them. Finally, Carlos turned to Javier, his voice barely above a whisper. What do you think? I think this is insane, Javier replied, his voice strained. But I also think we're running out of options, Carlos. We need that money, for our lives, for our families. Then we have to play his game, Carlos said reluctantly, his shoulders slumping in defeat. For Mum's sake, and ours. Alfredo watched them, a sly smile creeping onto his face. He had orchestrated this moment, knowing that deep down his sons craved the connection they had lost. They were caught in the web of their own making, and now they had to navigate their way out of it. There's more to this story than you know, he said cryptically, relishing the suspense that hung in the air. The brothers turned their gazes back to him, confusion etched upon their faces. As the screen faded to black, the final image lingered. Alfredo's knowing smile, the weight of the family secrets that still lay buried, and the uncertain path that awaited Carlos and Javier. The audience was left breathless, pondering the depths of betrayal, the complexities of love, and the ties that bind family, even when they threaten to tear it apart.